everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Calling in from Copenhagen in this hostel that looks like a spaceship. So that's why all the funky lights are behind me. So today we have our friend returning, Rhys Lindmark, along with him, Sara, Cadena, and Jamie Daudon. They are part of something called Root, whose mission is to transform the information age into the wisdom age. And they did a really cool research project called Building the Wisdom Age. And they interviewed a bunch of people who they viewed who were moving towards this wisdom age. And I was interviewed along with, representing the STOA. So I was lucky enough to be a part of this research and got sort of a sense of what it was about and saw their findings. And it was really cool how they broke things up into different like families in this wisdom movement. So today, Rhys, Sara, and Jamie are here to discuss their findings and share them, and then we'll have a discussion. So we're here for 60 minutes in total. I'll tag in Rhys in a moment. And if you have questions anytime, throw them in the chat. When we pivot to the discussion portion, either just raise your hand or put something in the chat. I'll call you and we can engage in a discussion and just ask your question to Rhys, Sara, or Jamie. So that being said, Rhys, welcome back to the Stoa, my friend.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, I guess the last time I was here was to talk about Terra Sapien, which was a book at the time and has now been changed to a different book, What Information Wants, which will be a different STOA session some other time. And then there was a first one at the beginning of COVID. So it's good to be back. It's good to see all of your faces here. And it is, yeah, I think I'm really excited to, can you guys hear me, by the way? Is my mic the right volume? Sick, thumbs up. Yeah, excited to dive into the wisdom age stuff. I think, what Jamie and Sara and I did was really fun and interesting, and being able to see this world of who is building what is really interesting. And it reminds me actually of what Peter wrote in 2018, the Memetic Tribes 2.0 piece, which Richard Dawkins just found finally, and retweeted. So that is that's kind of what we were inspired by to some extent. So I guess I have a question maybe to start with, folks, which is, and feel free to make yourself seen, turn off your or turn on your video. Just kind of raise your hand if you've already read the Wisdom Age piece that we made. So raise your hand if you have already read it. We got some hands. We got some non-hands. We got a half hand from Sara. You made it halfway through. That's fine. That's close enough. Anybody without their videos on? Maria? Did you read it? Did you read it the whole way, or did you not read it? Yeah. Did you read it or no? Not so much. A little bit. Okay, we got a little bit. Sara read part of it, but to remember is this one. Yes, we have some amount of reading and some amount of non-reading here. And so I think what I want to do is give kind of a quick overview of the piece, and then kind of talk about Jamie and Sara's, because Jamie and Sara in many ways were leading the project. Jamie did essentially all the interviews and all the synthesis, and then Sara did all the visuals. And I was kind of just like the translator between the two, between MBA Jamie and illustrator Sara, And so, yeah, but we'll give an overview of the piece, get their perspectives a bit, and then kind of dive into what we've seen to be some of the most impactful things for folks and have kind of a discussion around that. You good, Carmina? Yeah, no need to with the students on. Don't show the students. Great. So let's do it. So I'm going to share my screen. Boop, 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 boop. Can you see it? Thumbs up. We got a thumbs up. Nothing like getting a thumbs up. So yeah, as Peter said, this was we did interviews with a lot of folks. Here are some of the people. Here are all the people on the right-hand side. That again, yeah, Jamie interviewed almost all these people. I interviewed a couple. And the goal was to kind of to check in on what we see as kind of an emerging movement here. You could call it a post-capitalist movement. You could call it a systems change movement. You could call it whatever. We call it the wisdom age movement. And so we interviewed all these people. Some of them are academics, some of them are philanthropists, some of them are just random internet people like Peter, and it is all the above that we interviewed. And And we took all these interviews and kind of synthesized them into both some learnings from the interviews and then kind of how we saw the movement. And so I want to show a little bit about kind of for us, one of the key learnings here, which is, for us, we are trying to understand this elephant is a crucial part of the whole piece for us, which is like, we have, we're moving towards this future, this wisdom age future. This is exciting. But it's a bit blurry. There's no coherent vision of the future. And by the way, you can already, if you haven't seen the piece already, you can see Sara's beautiful visuals. And so it's kind of like this parable of the blind men touching an elephant, which, if you don't know that parable, is like one of the best parables to understand modern society, which is that each man sees, or each person sees something different depending on where they are. You have person in the back is like, oh, the tail's like a rope. And the person in the front is like, no, no, no. It's like the tusk is like a spear. And so that's kind of similar to the wisdom age, where we're all moving towards a shared future, but understand it differently. And so this elephant kind of came back again and again for us. And so now I want to talk about kind of the first section here, which is, we'll spend about half our time on the movement families and the other half kind of on these movement themes. The movement families are trying to understand the different sub-movements within this larger movement. And so let's kind of look at what that looks like. So, we call this the meta movement, or this kind of wisdom age movement. And there's these 12 families that exist, and we'll kind of show, they're going to fill in each of these little boxes. And so you can kind of imagine our current status quo here being capitalism. And then it's like, oh, you have these things that are opposed to it, stakeholder capitalism and post-capitalism, that are trying to make capitalism and markets more aligned with human values. And they're pretty similar, but post-capitalism is more like, we need to rebuild society. And stakeholder capitalism is more like going to Davos and kind of doing ESG metric kind of things, evolution versus revolution. And then the climate movement is like one specific instantiation of this kind of new post-capitalist, responsible capitalist movement. And then there's another one, though, which is like techno-optimism versus responsible tech, where you have all the techno-optimists who are out there going, technology and science will save us from climate change, from all these things. And then the responsible tech people are like, wait a second, it's already been kind of intense out there. What has Facebook done to society? What has, nuclear done to society, et cetera? So tech good versus tech complicated is what how we think about that. And all of these things, though, you can think of them as the wisdom economy. They all think that markets are like the way to, it's all their theory of change. They're not really trying to change the norms in society. They're not really trying to change the laws. They're not, so they're kind of focused on like, how do we make markets more aligned with human values? And then on the other side, though, it's like, wait a second, folks like social justice activism are like, whoa, 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 we kind of disagree with that, just like going through the markets framing. Let's actually kind of use the government and nonprofits and redirect it towards more equitable ends. And then you have something like effective altruism, which, if you haven't heard of it, is this like group of folks who are trying to like maximize their impact per dollar. And so while like social justice focus on like local marginalized groups with little voice, effective altruism focus on groups with no voice, whether it's folks in the global south and extreme poverty, like animals and factory farms who can't be like, hey, there's 70 billion of us dying every year, like help. Or people in the long-term future that are that don't exist yet, who it's hard for them to have a voice. And so that's effective altruism, but still all of these three that we've been talking about are very kind of macro perspectives. There's also stuff happening at the local and personal scale. So there's like liberalism, which is, and this is not like modern age American lefty liberals. This is the traditional like liberal sense, who are people who are into free speech and open discourse. And you can see this obviously, as it says here, this is sometimes in conflict to social justice activism, which is trying to spread more equitable language. A classic debate that's happening here is the social justice being like, let's like think about our language a little bit more, maybe like police it a bit or whatever. And the liberals are like, no, like never shut us down. And so both of those are right to some extent. So this is a battle happening at like a more like individual scale of people being like, let's have a marketplace of ideas in the social justice. Like, let's like think about our words more. And then a classic one, I think that's also pretty aligned with a lot of what the Stoa does, is the self-transformation piece, which is helping, it's not thinking about the macro system, it's just helping individuals become more wise and understand their own frames on reality and things like that. And so that's another kind of view on how to change the future. And then there's also the kind of middle ground here, not hyper macro, not personal, but like, let's build it like one community at a time. Some of these like co-op or commune movements have a lot of this vibe to them. And so that's kind of all of those, but there's one thing missing actually, which is, you know, all of this is all about change. It's all like really, the future is crazy, right? I mean, we're moving from the industrial age to the information age, or to what we want to call the wisdom age. And there's going to be a lot of changes happening, and there are a lot of changes happening. And so, and this was actually helped with Peter when we were kind of going through some of the feedback. Peter and Jamie and Sarah and I are all thinking about like, how do we get in some of the more conservative movements into this space? Because all the ones we've talked about, it's like, here's the social justice, here's the like the responsible techies or whatever. It's like, those are all kind of like, you know, more, I don't know, traditionally lefty or whatever groups. And so we're thinking how to get folks who are more conservative in. And yeah, we think that like all of this is change towards the wisdom age, while there's this like what we call like a skeptical inactivism, which are these folks who are more like, wait a second, let's like chill for a second. Like, don't forget about family. What about like religion? What about like family values? Like some of those things are legit, you know? And so like just like hyper going into the change direction is kind of scary. So that's kind of what this all looks like. We can take the elephant and we can kind of turn it into these different groups that are building this. And so a thing, as we've kind of shared this piece with folks, a thing that's been that as we've understand what has resonated with people, it's people to find their place in here. So you can kind of look at this and be like, okay, what am I most into? And you're like, well, I'm kind of a techno optimist, you know, like I really think that, you know, like I follow like progress studies stuff. I love Elon Musk, you know, like I think like the P Marca's Let's Build piece really, you know, it's time to build. That really got me excited. I'm into tech stuff, you know, I'm into techno optimism. Or maybe you look at this and you're like, really, I'm all about self-transformation. You know, I think that for myself, it's like I meditate all the time. I do these things. I'm trying to spread it with my friends, you know, like I'm into the psychedelics, whatever. Like, and so you can kind of place yourself on here. You're like, oh, maybe I'm a, you know, stakeholder capitalism versus post-capitalism. Like maybe I just kind of want to burn the whole thing down, you know, like I'm not really a stakeholder capitalist. So it's like trying to like change companies slowly. I'm just kind of like trying to burn it down. So take like maybe 30 seconds and just like look at this image for yourself and be like, where do I actually kind of fall here? And yeah, so with that, we're actually going to go into a little discussion, which is I'm actually going to keep this this screen up for a bit as we discuss, but maybe we'll even start with Jamie and Sara and then kind of go into the more general group. Sorry to call on you, Jamie, within Sara without you necessarily knowing you were going to be called on, but welcome. Let's start with Sara. Sara, where do you see yourself on this little chart?
Hello. So yeah, I guess right now I'm working on this project on life design. So I guess I kind of identify with a mix of different, like the self-transformation with building this community. And I definitely want to do it through like a market. Like I've identified that markets are going one way. I want to go the other way. So it's like merging.
Yep, you cut out, or at least for me.
Families, so I can yeah, it was like,
yeah, self-transformation vibes. You're now kind of back, but yeah, self-transformation, doing some life design, helping people kind of level up their own thing. Sara is working on a life design course, by the way, so feel free to check that out afterwards. And then yeah, Jamie, where do you kind of see yourself on this little map?
I'm hardcore skeptical in activism. No, I would say I just dropped it in the chat. I'm in the sort of like stakeholder capitalism, post-capitalism area here in terms of sort of like really fundamental, like a political economy type change. I think community organizing is very important to sort of build power to make that happen. If I was restricted to 3 of them, that's what I would go for. I think self-transformation is also super important.
It is kind of good to restrict yourself to like two, to be like,
Yeah.
okay, because you're like, oh, all these things seem good, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, does anybody else out there feel free to kind of just like speak up and say what you feel free to just kind of chime in. Where do you find yourself on the map?
Yeah, I would say self-transformation and community organizing, which is pretty evident with the Stoa. And then like maybe the third one would be like post-capitalism. But then there's parts of all of them that I'm drawn to as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and Maggie, I'm reading in the chat here, you know, Maggie feels all over the map. You know, Ron feels, you know, self-transformation with a certain form of skeptical and activism. That's it's nice to have that like skeptical and activism one where you're like, all this stuff is crazy. Does anybody else want to kind of say where they fall and why they fall there?
Feel free to jump off mute, anyone.
Sara, do you want to say a little bit more about your techno-optimist climate movement? And then now you're in kind of a different world.
So I don't know if it was movement. It's rather like for 10 years I worked in climate change, but rather so as a VC in clean tech, and then as an entrepreneur. So building a company to measure carbon emissions through science, like science-based sensors for cities, and really hoping, like working with a World Meteorological Organization to put science back inside the Paris Agreement. Really believing if we manage to take nature inside capitalism, it will work. And then working for the CEO of one of the largest European water and waste company to adapt its climate strategy to really completely try to move completely a large company toward 1.5 degrees trajectory. And then after 10 years in that, so I moved like 1.5, so like 1.5 years ago, thinking, okay, it doesn't work. Like you can put climate inside capitalism, but nature, it's already super hard, and human, let's not even talk about it. So I did like a 1 year of focus on rather the human part of transition. And I joined the Global Regeneration Collab. So focusing on like psychology, neuroscience, new modes of organization, system change, regeneration, and worked with like, for example, Demo Helsinki, which is a Finnish think tank working on system change. So yeah, that was a kind of a really move, like after like 10 years, really believing in technology, in like capitalism, and then thinking, okay, it will not work.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's a cool, yeah, as you said, you're deep in, you're like, okay, let's make these things work. And both the, as you said, that's, I hear when you say like, oh, we just like add nature into capitalism, that's like a classic stakeholder capitalism mindset, which is like, oh, we're not just like optimizing for profits, we're optimizing for profits, people, and planet. Okay, let's get planet in there and then everything will be good. And then you're like, oh man, this has been kind of tough. And so now you've kind of moved to the post-capitalism and self-transformation kind of phase where you're like, okay, what about these crazy new ideas out there? And also self-organizing. I kind of see as community organizing, where it's like, okay, we have all these people and they're kind of how can we create emergent behavior among these kind of little groups? So that's a cool shift. And I think one of the things that I hear there is a desire for, it's just a classic thing with this map too, where it's like, kind of no matter where you're at, if you're in responsible tech, you're just like, oh my God, like this is having no impact, like Google, Amazon, Facebook, how can we compete with that? You know, but if you're in the capitalism side, you're like, why am I, like, wherever you are, you're kind of like, oh my God, I'm not really doing much. That's a thing that I personally feel to some extent. It sounds like you had a bit. Maggie, do you want to share how you feel, why you feel all over the map?
I don't know if I'm ready to unpack that, to be honest.
That's cool.
Yeah, it depends on the day in the group, and I see a lot of value in transdisciplinary engagement. So
yeah, cool. Yeah, I think that's a tough and no pressure, of course. I think it's a tough thing where you are coming in. the transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary mindset makes you want to choose more than one group here, which is kind of a tough thing. Ron, do you want to chat about the like self-transformation with some skeptical and activism, and like what that kind of how that shows up for you?
Yeah, one thing that was just occurring to me is how they kind of fit together for me in that, and I definitely have a strong bent in this area, which is more a later in life thing of, if we don't do the self-transformation or addressing, character and maturity and psychology, that the other stuff can so easily fail. And that's also what kind of wants me to put I'm often the guy, sorry, that I can come across as a buzzkill at times because I want to be the guy putting the brakes on, all of these. I don't want to use the word utopian dreams because I don't think people necessarily think of it that way. But when there's a lot of idealism and a lot of shiny object and what's new, I'm very drawn to that as well. But I think, the main lesson of history is how often that goes south when there's not an appreciation and gratitude for the structures that we currently have. So yeah, I tend to always want to be the one to put the brakes, but hoping to do it in a way that's more skillful and doesn't seem to, want to dampen other people's vision. So that's why, I kind of feel the self-transformation and that work together, which is do that other stuff, but be sure to be working on yourself. And I know that's it's almost its own little culture war in the mimetic spaces, made famous by the Jordan Peterson stuff of, take care of clean your own house first before you try to change the world, and all the pushback to that. And I think misunderstanding about that, maybe what he was driving at.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's I mean, it totally makes sense that the skeptical and yeah, you're excited by these things, but people are so like, oh my God, it's gonna happen. And you're like, yo, like don't like, don't forget to work on yourself and like B, clean your own room first. And then B, it's like, yeah, I think you gave a great presentation of what some of this, what the skeptical and activists could say from a great like loving perspective, which is like, wait, there's all this stuff that exists. Do we really need to? There's this idea of Chesterton's fence, which is like, oh, let's just get rid of the fence. It's like, wait, why is the fence there? And so you have to kind of ask yourself like these things before you just like go about changing it. Also, one thing that you just talked about that I want to talk about, which is you talked about these little small culture wars that are happening. And that's kind of a cool perspective that we brought to this piece, which is in addition to kind of finding yourself here, you can also see, so we'll kind of go back into it, you can see how they all relate to each other. So here are like some of these patterns that I want to highlight. So one is that all of them, these are all, you can kind of think of them all as these like little mimetic organisms. And they're these memes that are trying to survive in society. And in order to do so, and by meme, I don't mean just pure internet meme, but like a big old myth that's like, getting together lots of people. And they need access to capital, whether it's social capital, financial capital, so it's like money or attention or whatever. And so you can kind of see like, okay, the wisdom economy as a whole thrives off of profit-based financial capital. It's like good, like capitalism is really good, just making more capitalism, like techno-utopianism, it's like the amount of like money that, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft made, it's like so much. And on the other side, it's like, oh, something like effective altruism or social justice activism, they get money like downstream of that through like nonprofits or government or whatever. And then from attention, you can see how like different people leverage it. So some like the techno-optimists have like monetize the attention economy, so they like kind of control that and get can extract the value there, while something like social justice activism or anybody in politics, they're like become super charismatic, some like AOC or Trump or whatever, and they become influencers to get elected. So this kind of like public performative thing where they are using the attention to shape the people. And so that's kind of two ways that two different groups can use attention. The second big piece here is like, yeah, each of them has to attract followers through narratives of meaning. So all these things you can think from a kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy perspective or like a needs perspective, where you're like, they all have, each of these organisms, these mimetic organisms have a need, like a basic need to like sustain themselves, like get oxygen, get capital, but they also they need to like draw people into them through meaning, this like longer term thing. And so each of them, they all bring people in, and kind of like you were saying, Ron, it's like, someone like Jordan Peterson says, this bottom one, like change yourself, change the world. You know, or even some of the social justice activists might say something like that too. Where it's like, oh, you need to start with yourself first, do the self work. And so they all have these different theory of change, which is like change, you know, change power, change the world, change your community, change the world, change yourself, change the world, change slowly, change the world, change what money deems as valuable to change the world, or like change philanthropy to change the world. Or you know, just pure capitalism, just like let's build things to change the world. So that's kind of how they all think about it, and they all like imagine a different future. These are the things that, and you can all like different people get pulled into different things, like all the like Elon Musk chads or whatever on Twitter, they get pulled into something like death is a choice and humans are a galactic civilization. It's like, oh man, like that's what I want. And again, I get that, that's cool, you know. While some other folks are like, no, we want a world where tech is aligned with human values, or you know, for the effective altruist, we're free of suffering and existential risks, or your life isn't determined by your sex or skin color, where the community supports each other, where all are wise, where we return to simpler times. Like these are all things that kind of pull people and go, oh, that's a future that I want to be building towards. And they all got slogans, obviously, you know, just like return to our past, it's time to build, save the planet, maximize your impact, fight fascism, build meaningful relationships, find yourself. These all kind of action-oriented like slogans that spread within these communities. So those are all kind of meaning things that people do. And then, yeah, you can kind of think of them just like how organisms have niches in reality, in our biosphere. So too do these movements have niches in our like meme sphere or in our ideosphere. And so they have kind of their own access. They have a monopoly on their access to capital and meaning. And so, for example, there aren't that many startups. There aren't that many like social justice startups. You know, like there's not like a startup that spins up and it's like, hey, we're gonna like, you know, make sure that like the poor folks can like, or the, you know, the LGBTQ plus folks can do. It's like that doesn't, the market doesn't reward that. And they're not, those people that are into that are like driven to startups to like build things in a different way than kind of the social justice. And so and there aren't, and the startups themselves aren't that, there's no like people who go through Y Combinator or whatever aren't like, aren't that social justice-y or whatever, you know, they're kind of just building. They think, you know, everybody has their own niche in this map where they're kind of doing their thing and are being extremely good at kind of doing their niche. And it's hard, like if you're like a social justice person who tries to get into like the Y Combinator startup world, you're kind of operating with a different language. Or if you're like a startup person who tries to get into Black Lives Matter and Me Too and stuff, it's kind of like hard to get into that world. So they all have their own like niches. And then kind of, as you know, Ron was saying, they're all kind of in relationship to each other. You know, stakeholder capitalism is a response to unfettered capitalism. Post-capitalism thinks stakeholder capitalism doesn't go far enough. You know, responsible tech thinks techno-optimism has gone too far, while effective altruism and social justice thinks that progress happens outside the whole wisdom economy. And liberalism thinks, you know, social justice activism has gone too far. And then self-transformation and community organizing thinks change happens at the micro scale. And then skeptical and activism is where worried the whole thing is changing too fast. And then one final note here is that they all have their own little superpowers and shadows, you know? So it's like, the like, let's, you know, if you say, let's build, like, let's go do stuff, blah, blah, then it's like, wait a second, but what about the little guy? What about this person what about the marginalized group over here? Or if you have, you know, these folks who are like, let's focus on the big picture, but they totally forget about like self-transformation and community work. And then you can also be like, yes, progress, like let's make progress happen. It's like, whoa, but what about tradition? What about these things that have worked for like a long time? So these are kind of 5 key patterns that show up when you look at them from this mimetic kind of competitive collaborative landscape. They need access to capital and meaning. They do it through these monopolies and niches, and they're kind of a reaction to each other, and they all exist in a superpower kind of shadow relationship. So I just wanted to like kind of share this additional way to view these in mimetic kind of competition with each other. Does anybody have any thoughts or reflections after they see these 5 key patterns? I'm looking at the chat, by the way. Blah, blah, blah. Someone's learning. Yeah, so Peter, do you want to say, how do you see them trying to influence and change the others?
So how do each of the families in the movement?
Yeah, you say it seems like each one of these movements are trying to influence and change others.
Mm-hmm. Oh, my comment in the...
yeah.
Yeah, so people were mentioning like other movements that were not included, like indigenous movements and whatnot. But it seems like all these ones are like active. They have like active mimetic agents trying to change other people's minds. Maybe even skeptical and activism has that component too. But there's like sort of a perhaps aggressive element in the other ones that are trying to change people's minds. Where I think a lot of people are doing good in the world, but they're not really being too forceful with some of their change. Because we have people talking about like the tiny home movement or a green burial, at the Stoa, and I don't see them like having campaigns to convert people.
Yeah, that's an interesting point actually, which is that you can kind of just like genes and organisms want to replicate, and the ones that don't die off. So too does that happen with memes. And so you have, there's a group called the Spinners in early the United States, and they were all celibate and didn't do any missionary work. And so they lasted for roughly one generation and then died. They have like a Wikipedia page and nothing else. And similarly, all these groups, they have this kind of missionary nature to them, which is that they're trying to change each other. They're trying to like operate in this mimetic space and get more attention, get more capital. Because if you don't, you kind of get like out-competed if you're just kind of like existing and walled and ponding in your own kind of like chill niche. Yes, Sarah, I want to ask, get to your question here about like, tell me more about, this Indigenous led initiatives and how you see that kind of playing into this map or where it's not here.
You mean me, Sarah, or there is another?
Sarah Dubreuil, that's you, Dubreuil, yeah.
No, yeah, it's more that
there's two Sarahs, you're right, oh my God.
That's right. It was more to complete the map because you've got all this movement of, and it's not just like led by Indigenous, it's Indigenous thinking, like thinking in a much more integrated way. And I think it's interesting, like in the north, you've got like Turtle Village, but I guess that in Global South, there are many initiatives kind of working on that. And it really answers also a need, I guess. So it was just a few words that I didn't see here, like, so indigenous, regeneration also linked to all the permaculture word, also all the word around commons, the peer-to-peer foundation and all. So yeah, this was a few words on complexity science. And then maybe to complete, but it's because I'm European and even more, I'm based in France. So I guess that here the ecosystem is a bit different. We've got a lot of Catholic left, actually, people, leftist, that come from 19th century that are really active on the transition that I guess you don't have. So because here, I guess things are more resilient over the time. So we change less quickly.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that there's I do agree to some extent that, and we'll get to the complexity science thing in a second, but I think, where someone like the kind of, I see someone like the peer-to-peer, and this was something that, when Jamie and I were kind of doing the final synthesis, we didn't know exactly where to put it. This like peer-to-peer movement, like, P2P wiki and all those things, like those exist to some extent in my mind in the post-capitalist space where they're kind of like, okay, we are trying to do things. We're not trying to change, like make sure that like Amazon gives 2% of their income or whatever to like a global, carbon thing or whatever. It's like, we're trying to like make things peer-to-peer in a bottom-up way, like do things in a weird commoning way. So that's kind of one place that we imagine them. The other place that they kind of fit is in the like community organizing layer, where it's kind of like how it's thinking about emergent groups of like, peer-to-peer behavior. And so they don't say it as like, oh, we're community organizing. They say it as we are doing peer-to-peer work, peer-to-peer to peer-to-peer to peer. And then before you know it, you got a community there. So that's kind of where we see them in the space. I think the Indigenous-led groups are really interesting and cool here. And they have, to some extent, they might be in like the skeptical and activism side of just like, whoa, like we've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, and so like how, like, let's make sure we kind of go back to that kind of, wise tradition or whatever you want to call it. So I think that's to some extent where they fall. I think to some extent part of it is what Peter was talking about before, which is that some of the Indigenous groups, because the map, it's like, how big should the map be or whatever? And I think the Indigenous groups might not be mimetically replicating enough to like be powerful enough to be on the map. That's like another kind of way my mind goes here. I also want to say what you talked about with complexity science goes into, we got all the cool things here. So this is, so we've taken our elephant and we've taken it from this like, what is this thing, to like, oh no, we kind of know what it looks like. It's like these 12-ish things all kind of competing for mimetic space. And getting to complexity science is, and as I'm talking about this, feel free to type more things in the chat. Keep doing that. That's great. You know, so we know what the world looks like. This is all a what question to some extent. Like this is, you know, these groups that are actively trying to get capital and trying to like control attention and financial capital. But like, how do we know? What lens do we use to understand this reality? You know, and so we call these, instead of like movement families, they're actively trying to get like mimetic landscape, whatever. These are like just like epistemologies, like ways of understanding the world. And so this gets into the complexity science thing that you were talking about, Sara. So yeah, they all ask, so each frame has a certain way that they view these movement families. They all ask, how does the wisdom economy relate to the rest of society? That's kind of what they're all asking. And so like something that, you know, Jamie Daudon is really into is that this kind of political economy frame, where it's like, hey, we have the economy, this wisdom economy, it's capitalism, it's post-capitalism, all these things. And then how does that relate to the government? How does that relate to movements? How does that relate to all this stuff? So it's like, this is how political economy kind of sees the world. I mean, this is kind of, imagine these as all just like little academic fields or whatever. It's like, let's try to understand what's going on in society. Here's the economy, here's the political piece. How do they talking to each other? There's also a crew, which is the STS crew, the Science, Technology, and Society crew. And they're focused both on how like technology impacts folks and also how innovation works and things like that. And so they don't call it the wisdom economy, or the economy, they call it science and technology. And then there's the rest of society. And so they're kind of trying to understand how those two things relate to each other. And if you're aware of stuff like meta science or progress studies, those all kind of live here, trying to like increase the rate at which we like can produce science and technology for society. And then systems thinking, complex adaptive systems, that kind of stuff kind of lives here. So it's like these folks, you know, they see, they look for feedback loops. They use these little arrows. It's like, okay, how is the macro system connecting? And this is like a classic Marx thing, base and superstructure. But it's like, how does the big, how do these macro like things in society, how those relate to the ideologies in people's minds, you know? And so like the people are thinking like this, and then that gets manifest in terms of these big capitalist structures, and those things relate back to the minds in these ways. And so there's like a feedback loop there. And they also, the systems thinking folks also look for patterns throughout this stuff, where it's like, okay, we are, here is, let me think of a specific example of this. Pattern that is happening is, I guess like the patterns across groups, like they are all trying to get capital and attention. It's like, that's like a shared thing among all of them. And then finally, there's this frame that kind of I've been using the whole time, which is sometimes talked about as cultural evolution, sometimes talked about as like mimetic evolution or whatever, and mimetic tribes in Culture War 2.0. And this is like, hey, here are all these movements kind of as species competing for survival. And so the cultural evolutionist types kind of, yeah, take all of these things as object and kind of understand how they relate. So these are kind of four frames that like people are using to understand what's going on. And I just think it's worth differentiating these frames, like something like systems thinking. There's no like, yes, there's stuff like Santa Fe Institute and New England Complex Systems Institute, lots of stuff like that, but they're not kind of trying to garner mimetic space or like, you know, like run for office that often, or like there's no like big new startup that's like a complexity science startup. Like those things can exist, but there's kind of a differentiation between like movements that are trying to push forth in the world and these frames that are kind of understanding the world. Does that, do you agree with that, Sara? Or does that kind of, Sara Dubreuil, does that make sense for how we see kind of complexity science relating to the rest of the movements?
Yes, it makes sense to me.
Yes. Great. Yeah, so I think, and super agree with what Jamie said there, which is that we emphasize the US, like we just interviewed lots of North America people, and so like we kind of chatted with those folks, and that is another reason why we missed out on some of the more like indigenous folks and things like that. So yeah, I think that I'm thinking about the last kind of 15 minutes here. And I guess one thing, I want to spend a little bit of time on like more general Q&A. But before I do that, I think just I want to do a final skim through the rest of the piece and then have Jamie and Sara kind of share kind of how they related to it and some like learnings or things like that. So the rest of the piece, by the way, starting with that, yeah, so we've spent most of this thing talking about the kind of movement families and how they all relate to each other. There's this other section on movement themes, which is mostly, it looks at this big old graph that looks like it's this graph and how they we're transitioning out of the industrial age into the wisdom age. What does that look like? And we kind of paint each of these groups as kind of affecting each other. So it's like technology is becoming more networked. And so that's how we get mutual aid groups and DAOs and cooperatives and stuff like that. And so we kind of look at how they all relate to each other. And that's kind of this macro shift that's happening. And we see how the wisdom age, each little part of it is kind of affecting each other towards this new kind of networked, generous, and holistic future. And then we also look at the status of the meta movement. And this is where we actually get in some of the interviews and say, okay, cool. And the rough idea is that these folks who are building this out, it's been kind of germinating for a while, but hasn't had that much, but it's mostly been ideas and germination. And now it's everybody kind of feels like, oh, we're actually allowed to think in this kind of wisdom age, post-capitalist way or whatever. And so they feel like we're starting to actually go out there and build some of this infrastructure for building this new wisdom age, because it's a big old transition that's happening. And so a big just thing for all of us is, we've opened the possibility of the wisdom age and are now starting to build it, and especially building the infrastructure for future folks to kind of build out the rest of this wisdom age. So that's kind of how the rest of the piece goes. It's a long scrolly piece, which is fun. And then, by the way, if you really want to, there's a whole other section about with people, giving people advice or advice that we got from folks, requests from the interviewees and stuff like that. That's in a separate web page that you can find at the bottom. So that's kind of the rest of the piece. And I think I want to just check in with Jamie and Sara, Sara Cadena, and say, I guess, Jamie, I think it would be fun for you to share just kind of, for you did all these interviews, 20 plus interviews with folks, and tell us all a little bit about how you got from, oh my God. And the thing that Jamie and I had was this beautiful lineup here, which was, Jamie was just over with us for the summer and was, and the issue was that, our goal was to do this tweet. Oh, you're a systems thinker? Name all the systems. And so Jamie had to get all this stuff together. So Jamie, tell us a little bit about what that was like to go from the interviews to turning it into a more of a presentation thing.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Rhys. Yeah, I think for me, just in terms of the process of completing the report, just doing, knowing you have limited time, doing interviews and trying to sort of map at least some of the key movements and understand what people are pushing towards was very challenging. It's a very unstructured process. So I think we're at the goal of this was to add some structure to this and help people sort of reflect back with that sort of major diagram of where do I fit? And then I think for me, the second way that I think about this work now is sort of all these, there's maybe, 7 or 8 different movements that are pushing towards changing fundamental things about our society in the next 30 to 50 years. And kind of trying to project the future based on none of these movements completely winning and getting having their fully realized version of the world. But if you kind of average out these movements, and you assemble them together, what is being built. So I think some of the second half of the report kind of goes into a little bit of how are the movements interacting with each other and what is collectively being built. And some of them are mutually reinforcing, decentralized governance makes way for community organizing, makes way for changes in political systems, and then some of them are in tension with one another. So I think trying to understand some of these longer term interaction effects and sort of what is collectively being built by these different movements was particularly interesting and also challenging for me. So definitely an enjoyable process to go through, and I hope it adds some value to the way that you think about the way that the future is being built by these positive, kind of structural change level movements.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, it's a cool, in the time scale that you talk about there is great too, 30, 50 years. How are they in tension with each other? How are they kind of, where are the loops between them though, that where they're kind of mutually co-reinforcing. I also want to say note on this, when we tweeted this out, I just like randomly, like in my like tweets or whatever, I like mentioned her, Nikita, and this was a pretty viral tweet, you know. So we were chatting with a viral person, and she read it, and she was like, and so she said something like, "LOL," like I said, try to name all the systems, and like this is what they actually did it, you know. She was like, this was legit, like y'all actually named all the systems. So that was kind of a fun thing for us. Sara, Cadena, what was it? Tell us what it was like for you as a person who, you know, was mostly coming in from the illustrator side and stuff like that, and you were kind of like diving into the whole world of systems change and all that. What was it like for you to create this piece? Any kind of learnings or reflections on it?
Okay. Yeah, I could say like 2 or 3 things. One is my role is not being an illustrator. I just like to doodle, and it just happened to be that Rhys like found out like this doodling skill, and he's like, oh, what if you design this white paper from Ruth? And I was like, okay. So I never expected that. Second, I guess for my whole life I've always been like, I hate history, I hate politics, I hate finance. I've been into like another types of topics, and then this was like boom, so many things happening. So it was more than just doodling. I felt like it was sort of a course on the go. While I doodled, I learned and I questioned myself, and I also try to understand also, as all of you have said, where in the map am I, or even my parents, like my network, who are the people that are skeptical. For example, my family, in most of my actions they tend to be like skeptical, but being them like that has motivated me to do so many things in my life. So I kind of acknowledge their skepticism, because for me it has been like my motor to continue. So yeah, it was a really personal reflection, and just seeing it live is really interesting, that it can trigger discussion. For me, that's really like how visuals can translate Rhys's ideas and Jamie's, and just being here and talking about it. So yeah, I would summarize it that way.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, that's a fun, it's kind of like, it reminds me of, for me, when I was a child growing up and I didn't like biology at all. I was always like, oh, memorize biology stuff or memorize. And I was like, I don't really like this. But then after seeing this kind of big history perspective and putting genes in this more macro story and how genes work and how, you know, mitochondria, blah, blah, I was like, oh my God, this is actually amazing. And so for you, you're like, oh, I'm not really a history, you know, like, and you're like, oh, well, I guess I'm a history person now. Like, let's learn about history and technology. Beautiful. So with that, I think I kind of want to, if you have any, as Peter said, have any questions, drop in the chat. I'm going to let Peter kind of organize this Q&A piece. But thank you again for the interviewees for being interviewed, and Jamie for leading all those interviews, and for Sara for doing the illustrations, and for all of you for coming today. And yeah, let's just do like a more general Q&A right now. So I guess I'll stop sharing. If we need to look at more wisdom age stuff, we can.
Cool. Yeah, we have about 10 or 8 minutes. Maybe we'll go a little bit over the hour if can sneak in 1 or 2 questions. So either put your questions in the chat or just raise your hand. You know, I'll start with like a really broad question. How do you define the wisdom age? You know, it's like the through line of all these family and this meta movement seems like they're change makers, and there's like they want to change something for the better. But like, how does wisdom fit into that kind of each one of these families?
Good question. And I said that I was going to I said I just took away the screen share, but now it's back. My answer to this roughly, well, so wisdom is kind of a funny, we just had to choose a random term, you know, to be like, you can call us the good age or something. Like there was no, it wasn't necessarily clear what it should be. And I think for us, wisdom gets at this thing, this idea here, which is, we kind of see it as this macro shift, which is this old reality of centralization and kind of scarcity with people. So that's kind of the macro thing that's going with people who have a reductionist ethics and understanding. Those are people kind of just like push the world down to these boxes. Like that is shifting now to this new age of networks and in kind of networked organizing, networked everything with the internet, and then also generosity with people starting to have enough money and being able to be generous and abundant with each other. So we're switching to that age with people who have holistic ethics and understanding. And so the holistic ethics is kind of this, bentoism, like thinking in terms of like, not just focusing on yourself, but focusing on everybody else. And then also, holistic understanding, kind of not just thinking from one lens, but thinking from lots of lenses. That's how I kind of think of it. And like wisdom, I think gets a lot at the second piece here, holistic ethics and understanding. And I think that for the top piece, we were also tempted to call it like the networked wisdom age. And so like the networked gets at like the kind of collective piece, while the holistic gets at kind of the personal piece. So that's kind of how we slightly think about the wisdom ages. It's networked and it's holistic ethics and understanding.
Do you want to add something to that, Sarah or Jamie?
Great.
So I saw you had your mute off. James, you had a question.
Hello, friends. Yeah, I enjoyed this piece thoroughly. When was it a couple months ago that it came out, and I read it, nodded along with it. Yet I might be maybe part of the choir on this one that doesn't need a whole lot of preaching too. So I'm curious, kind of who in your head, in your mind, who is this designed for, and who do you think or hope that this map would have the biggest impact on?
Good question. I think maybe even, Jamie, from your perspective, who did you think this would have the biggest impact on?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that when we started out, the hope that we had was that it was going to help sort of people understand like where they are within the space and sort of define some, not even define lanes in the sense that things need to be differentiated, but we heard from some people that we chatted with that there needs to be, like, for example, between the stakeholder capitalism and post-capitalism spaces, like there is actually some differences there in terms of how they're approaching change making. And a lot of that can be lumped together, and there's sort of like weak definition or like weak differentiation of terminology. And so there's like a set of terminology that goes around stakeholder capitalism, like reimagining capitalism, there's like an inclusive capitalism, like there's buzzwords that are used to really refer to what stakeholder capitalism is about. And then there are buzzwords and movements that are used to refer to what post-capitalism is about. And we heard from some people, especially in the post-capitalism space, that it's useful to sort of differentiate a little bit and create some divisions. And I think that's one example. So we were hoping, not that it like drives people apart, but like creates some definition within a blurry space that people can sort of figure out where they align with, and then also kind of like, I don't know, define a singular movement as different from others that more clearly.
Yeah, and then Sara, did you have any thoughts on like how, as you were making some of the visual stuff, the audience that you had in mind, or the impact on who?
I think
Sara, that was Sara. That was a question.
Oh, sorry, Sara. Oh, sorry. I was like, yeah.
You're mute, still mute, life.
Wait, pause. Which Sara?
You. Sorry. Yeah, for you, Sara. Do you think that how are you thinking about the audience and how you wanted to impact them?
Okay. Definitely, I guess through visuals, right? Like how can, I guess one of the things I can highlight from the process is how we were able to translate Jamie's like thoughts. Like Rhys was the translator, and I was able to like try to visualize all this, and how can visuals help people that maybe don't have the technical words can also relate even to this content. Like I don't have a particular, I don't know exactly who, but definitely people that can, like the visuals can be like a way if you haven't been in complete contact with all this new terminology.
Yeah, totally. I think that the visuals were, and I think James, your question is a good one, which is like, I think, to some extent we were mostly we wanted this to be something that, when we didn't really succeed at this, we wanted this to be something that like all of the like 25 interviewees or whatever, that they saw and were like, yeah, this is amazing, this is great work, and that they like kind of shared it or whatever. And so that was kind of how we were imagining our audience. And it's interesting is I think for some folks it really resonated and did kind of spread within like the systems changing world. You're like, oh wow, this is cool stuff. And I think it, but it's definitely not quite, it's long, it's a long piece. And I think it is, there is some preaching to the choirness about it. And so I think that I think it's mostly a way for people who are already in this world to get textured on it. And I think it's an okay way to do foot in the door with people who aren't deep into it, or like, oh, it's just like an elephant. And like, let's kind of, they might not get to the whole thing, but I think getting a bit there. And I think that if we were trying to do a more kind of mass movement thing, it would take some of these similar ideas, but would not necessarily be as kind of in-depth or long. But so it's mostly focused on the people who are already kind of in it themselves, but coalescing things in a kind of a simple way. Any other final questions before we wrap up here?
Maybe I'll sneak in one more myself, if he was alive. Yeah, so we had a session at the Stoa a couple of weeks ago where a representative of a EA, Effective Altruism, came in and talked to someone from the monastic academy, the monastic setting, and they like kind of method act the movement itself, and then they had a conversation with each other, like what they could learn, and it was really cool, that engagement. And so the question is like, any thought on how these movements can get into conversation with each other? And recently I was talking to Thomas Bjorkman, who's kind of spearheads the whole metamodern emerged perspectiva movement. And he wants to have like festivals with like people who are in the psychedelic community, the cryptocurrency, earth regeneration, and get them to talk to each other. Because there's almost like this existential horse blinders that are on, and they're like doing good stuff, but it's kind of a narrow focus. And just, they're not even aware of like the good work that the other people are doing. So that awareness piece is important. That's why I like this piece that you guys did. But then the other move there is how to like kind of have those conversations amongst these different movements and tribes and whatnot.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there's, well, I think that's to some extent part of my frame on the world, is just being able to like when I'm like, oh, here's this, the social justice activist who's trying to do good, and here's the skeptical activist, like taking these different frames, like trying to show each of them in like kind of like a loving light, I think is like a lot of what this piece tries to do and what I try to do, to like be a chameleon or whatever. And so I think doing something like that where people are kind of role playing their own frame or any frame is like a really powerful, and for you as like an audience member, it's like, can you really, it's like the classic thing where it's like, can you steel man the other position? Can you like really get into, even if you don't really love the kind of self-transformation, like, can you actually like get them, and could you like be them and like pretend to like get hyped about their worldview? And so I think that's cool and that's interesting. I think that, yeah, Peter, I mean, you're getting to like a fundamental difficulty with this stuff, which is like, is how people can both be focused and working and jamming on their own thing. I was chatting with a woman last night who leads like a relatively big startup that is in theory super aligned with crypto, but she hasn't looked at it at all because she's just been like very focused on her worldview. And so it's like, how do we get folks to kind of overlap and connect with each other more often and recognize the benefit that each other providing, the shared outcomes? I don't know. I think that's tough. I think it's like these occasional meta convenings, like, Thomas Bjorkman stuff and things like that, I think could be part of this, but I think that's kind of an open question for all of us going forward, though, so you don't just get like tribed out, that instead we have these kind of bigger things. And then I want to say one other note here, which is, yes, Sara, I think, one note I want Daryl just said is like, another way to think about this is that these things need to happen at different scales. So it's like having something like Burning Man is a big, 75,000 person thing that all these groups can kind of come together and interact at. And so there's like these like little scales that are like personal or kind of like community to community or like within your town. And then there's these like bigger events that like lots of folks can come to that might be a more communal meeting ground. And then Sara Jabril, what you said, yeah, I think that the question on wisdom is difficult and exciting. I think that for me, I mostly there's a lot of different frames on it and different language that people use, but I think in the end, it's mostly all about holistic understanding of the world, viewing it from different frames, different perspectives, body perspective, mental perspective, etc., and then holistic ethics, not just thinking about yourself right now, but thinking about the animals and the future people and all stuff. I think pretty much if you have those two things, you got wisdom down. So that's have the confidence of a rich white man perspective on that. So I think that's good. Peter, anything else? Or yeah, thank you all again for coming today. This was fun and hope it was helpful. I'll post a couple things in the chat. One is, this is Peter's piece that was in some ways kind of a pre-inspiring of this piece, the Memetic Tribes and Culture War 2.0 piece. And then here's the actual Wisdom Age thing itself, root.co/Wisdom Age. Also, if you're into this stuff, we have like a fellowship where divergent systems thinkers can come and hang out. If you want, Sara is a life designer. So if you ever want to hit her up, Chainspiration, she can help you design your life. And Jamie is currently a student, but if you want to hire him after he's done, he's really good at synthesizing lots of stuff from responsible capitalism and aligned things.
Awesome. Yeah. And closing thoughts on my end. I actually really like the Wisdom Age coinage. I think it's good coinage. And it's like everyone wants to be wise, right? But anyone would be foolish if they thought they were wise. So and it's like you said, we need to have that holistic perspective, and that direction, I think, is a good superordinate thing to have. So I really, really like that coinage, and I really like this piece. Rhys, always sending you lots of love, my friend. Sara, thank you for doing this. Jamie, excellent interview skills. So definitely do hire him if you have any cool ass projects to have. And the next session at the Stoa is tomorrow, Vibe Camp, manifesting the vibes from URL to IRL. All these people on this Twitter, they were, I don't know, it was some cool community. And then it's coming in person. They're having like some adult camp where they do all this cool intersubjective stuff. So check that out. That's tomorrow. And yeah, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.